The Atlantic Ocean was calm that morning, deceptively so. The kind of calm that made even seasoned sailors uneasy. Jake Mallory, 54, stood on the weathered deck of his old fishing sailboat, the Liberty, as the sun began its slow climb over the horizon. The salty air danced with the scent of brewing coffee and the distant cry of seagulls. Jake had lived most of his life by the sea. A retired U.S. Coast Guard officer, he'd spent decades pulling stranded boaters from rough tides, patrolling for drug runners, even helping in hurricane rescues. But now, life had slowed. He offered quiet fishing tours off the Maine coast, just him, his boat, and stories too strange for tourists to believe. On that particular morning, Jake had planned nothing more than a few hours of solo sailing, maybe a line in the water, and some peace of mind. But fate had other plans. As the Liberty cruised along the edge of a restricted zone known as Zone Echo, Jake noticed something odd in the water. A tiny, half-deflated orange raft bobbing in the waves like a forgotten toy. Squinting through his binoculars, he could just make out a man inside, waving a white shirt in desperation. Jake's heart jumped. Zone Echo had been a classified naval training site for decades, closed off to the public since the 1980s. The Coast Guard always treated it like it was radioactive. Sail too close, and you'd find a warning chopper overhead within minutes. But something didn't sit right. Why would someone in trouble be out there in the first place? Jake didn't wait. He turned the helm, throttled up his motor, and surged into forbidden waters. Every rule he'd once enforced, he now ignored, because when someone's in trouble at sea, you help first and ask questions later. As he pulled up to the small vessel, he saw a man in his early 30s, dark hair, sunburnt skin, panicked eyes, shouting in a heavy accent. "There's someone hurt. Please. Help us." Lying across the floor of the dinghy was another young man, unconscious, with a makeshift bandage on his thighs soaked in blood. The motor was dead, there was no radio, and they had no flares. No papers. No life jackets. It didn't make sense. Jake's instincts kicked in. He hauled both men aboard the Liberty, laid the injured one flat, and used his own belt as a tourniquet. "Hang in there, buddy," Jake muttered. "You're not dying on my boat." He reached for his marine radio to call for help, but then, something unexplainable happened. The water around them began to rumble. At first, Jake thought it was a sudden shift in the current. Then came a low vibration that buzzed in his teeth. A deep hum, mechanical. He turned, and to his disbelief, the ocean rose up. Like a scene from a military thriller, a massive black submarine breached the surface, less than 100 yards off his port bow. No markings. No flags. Just a sleek, silent force of steel emerging from the deep. Jake's mouth went dry. In all his years at sea, he'd never seen anything like it. A hatch opened. 3 men in dark uniforms with no insignia stepped out. One lifted a megaphone. "You are in restricted waters. Step away from the vessel and identify yourself." Jake raised his hands slowly. "I'm helping 2 distressed sailors. One is badly hurt." A tense silence followed. Then, the man replied more calmly, "Bring them aboard. Now." Jake hesitated. Every bone in his body screamed at him to be cautious. He didn't know who these people were, military, foreign, covert, but the injured man groaned, his breathing shallow and labored. There was no time. With the help of the other man, Jake carried the injured one to the edge and handed him off to the crew of the sub. As the other man prepared to follow, he turned and looked Jake in the eyes. Something about his gaze was different now, less panicked, more grateful. "You didn't have to stop," he said quietly. "But you did. Thank you. You have no idea what this meant." Then, without another word, he vanished into the hatch. The submarine sank moments later, as silently as it had appeared. Not a single ripple remained. Jake was left alone in the waves, no radio contact, no witnesses, just the Liberty, rocking gently in the forbidden waters. Days passed. Then weeks. Jake filed an incident report with the Coast Guard. They brushed it off. "There's no active operations in Zone Echo," they said. "You probably saw a sonar mirage or a civilian research sub." But Jake knew better. He had felt the power in that water. He had seen the urgency in those men's eyes. Friends told him he'd imagined it. That stress and isolation at sea could mess with your mind. But Jake didn't care what they thought. Until one fall morning, everything changed. It came in a small manila envelope. No return address. Inside was a single piece of thick, cream-colored paper with clean, block-type letters. "Your act of compassion broke through barriers we're trained to defend. You saved lives that can never be acknowledged. But you will not be forgotten. Thank you, Jake Mallory." Folded inside was a photograph, Jake at the helm of the Liberty, lit by the golden glow of sunrise. The angle suggested it had been taken from the waterline, likely through a periscope. And beside it, a solid gold coin. Heavy. Pressed with markings not in any language Jake could recognize. He sat for a long time, staring out at the sea. That day, Jake understood something profound. In a world built on borders, of countries, of rules, of fear, it's the human connection that transcends everything. It wasn't about who those men were, or where they came from. It was about doing the right thing when nobody else would. And somehow, someone had noticed. Jake kept the letter and coin in a wooden box by his bed. He never spoke of it to tourists, and only rarely to friends. But he never forgot the moment he crossed the line, literally and figuratively, and chose kindness over caution. In life, we're often told to stay in our lanes, follow the rules, and avoid what we don't understand. But sometimes, the right thing exists beyond the boundaries. And when it does, we have to be brave enough to go there. Jake Mallory didn't rescue just a boat. He rescued something much bigger. He rescued humanity in a moment where fear could have ruled, but didn't. In a divided world, one act of compassion can surface truth, unity, and the extraordinary. Kindness doesn't care about borders. And sometimes, kindness brings submarines to the surface.